My granddaughter was sitting in the corner of the living room, pressing herself against the wall like she was trying to disappear, when my son-in-law's father pointed his finger at her and said, "Pick it up." Now, she was 7 years old. She had accidentally knocked a decorative bowl off the end table while reaching for her juice. The bowl didn't even break. It just fell on the carpet and rolled a few inches. But the way he spoke to her, I'd heard drill sergeants with more warmth. I set down my coffee mug slowly. I didn't say a word. Not yet. Let me back up a little, because this story didn't start that Thanksgiving. It started about 3 years before, when my daughter Renee brought home the man she was going to marry. His name was Philip. Good-looking kid, sharp dresser, worked in commercial real estate. I liked him well enough at first. He was polite to me, opened doors for Renee, laughed at my jokes even when they weren't funny. The kind of young man you want to like. What I didn't know, couldn't have known yet, was that Philip came with baggage. And that baggage had a name. His father's name was Conrad Albright. Conrad had built a mid-sized real estate development company in Charlotte, North Carolina, over about 30 years. He wasn't a household name, but in certain circles he was well known. The kind of man who donated enough to get his name on a building at the university. The kind who sat on 3 nonprofit boards, but talked about those boards at every dinner party. He wore his wealth like a second skin. You couldn't have a conversation with him without understanding, within the first 2 minutes, exactly how successful he considered himself to be. I'm a retired postal worker, 34 years with the United States Postal Service, carrier, then supervisor, then postmaster of a small district in Western Virginia. I retired at 62 with a decent federal pension, a modest house that was paid off, and the deep, unspectacular satisfaction of a life lived without pretense. I'm 68 now. I grow tomatoes. I take walks. I call my granddaughter on Sunday mornings. When Conrad first met me, he shook my hand, looked me up and down, and smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Philip tells me you are a mailman," he said. "Not a postal worker, not a postmaster, a mailman." 34 years, I said. Federal pension, full benefits. Not bad. He nodded the way a man nods when he's already moved on in his head. That's great. That's really something. That was the first time. It wasn't the last. Over the next 2 years, as Renee and Philip got engaged and then married, I learned who Conrad Albright was in more detail than I ever wanted. He had opinions about everything. About how Renee should decorate their first apartment. About what neighborhood they should live in. About whether Philip's salary was appropriate for his age and ambition. He once told me, at a birthday dinner for my grandson, I'll come back to him, that the neighborhood I lived in was comfortable, for what it is. I'm not sure what he thought it was. It was a quiet street in a small Virginia town where I'd raised my daughter by myself after her mother passed. I'd painted that porch myself. I'd planted every one of those rose bushes along the front walk. But Conrad didn't see any of that. What Conrad saw was square footage and resale value. My daughter loved Philip, and Philip was a decent man caught in a difficult position. He'd been raised by his father to believe that Conrad's approval was the highest form of validation available to a human being. It wasn't entirely his fault. I'd seen it before. Good people warped just slightly out of shape by a domineering parent. The one who suffered most, though, was my granddaughter, Lily. Lily was Renee's daughter from a brief relationship before Philip. A good little girl, quiet and thoughtful with her mother's brown eyes, and a habit of carrying a small stuffed rabbit named Mr. Buttons wherever she went. Philip had adopted her legally. He loved her. That was never in question. Conrad, on the other hand, had never fully accepted her. He didn't say it outright. He was too calculated for that. But he would introduce her at family events as Philip's stepdaughter when he knew full well the adoption was legal and final. He'd buy extravagant gifts for Philip's younger brother's children and hand Lily something small and afterthought-ish, the kind of gift you grab at the airport. He'd correct her table manners in front of company in a tone he'd never use with the other grandchildren. And then came Thanksgiving. It was at Conrad's house, a large home in the Myers Park neighborhood of Charlotte, the kind of house designed to impress, all clean lines and cathedral ceilings and furniture that looked like it had never been sat on. Conrad's wife, a quiet woman named Sylvia, who spent most of her time agreeing with her husband, had set a beautiful table. There were 17 people there, Philip's brother and his family, 2 of Conrad's business associates, who apparently had nowhere else to be, an aunt who flew in from Phoenix, and me, the mailman. I'd driven down the night before and stayed at a hotel nearby. Renee had offered to let me stay at their place, but I knew Conrad would be in and out, and I preferred to have my own space. At 68, I've learned the value of a door you can close. The afternoon started pleasantly enough. Football on in the background, good smells coming from the kitchen, kids running around the backyard. Lily was playing with her rabbit near the window seat in the living room, keeping to herself the way she often did in large family gatherings. She was a little shy. Conrad had a way of making her shyer. I was sitting in the armchair by the fireplace with a cup of coffee, talking to Philip's brother about nothing important when I heard it. The sound of something soft hitting the floor, and then Conrad's voice. "Pick it up, now." I looked over. Lily had knocked the decorative bowl off the side table. It was on the carpet, unbroken. She was against the wall, small and frozen, staring at Conrad with those wide brown eyes. Conrad was standing over her, not touching her, but the way he was positioned, too close, his face tight, his voice carrying that particular edge that men like him use when they want to remind someone smaller of their place. It made my chest go cold. "I said pick it up," he said again. "And don't touch things that aren't yours." Lily reached down with trembling hands and picked up the bowl. She placed it back on the table carefully, her chin wobbling. "Sorry," she whispered. "You need to learn to be more careful," Conrad said. "That bowl is worth more than your grandfather's." He stopped himself. He looked at me. I was already looking at him. I didn't say anything. I just held his gaze for a moment, put my coffee mug down on the side table next to me, and stood up. "Lily," I said, "why don't you come sit with Grandpa?" She crossed the room in about 4 steps and tucked herself under my arm. I could feel her shaking slightly. Conrad straightened up and walked back toward the kitchen like nothing had happened. That was the moment, not just because of what he said, because of what he almost said, and because of the way my granddaughter trembled. That was the moment I decided to find out exactly who Conrad Albright was. Here's the thing about a career in the federal government. You spend 34 years in one place, you build a network. Not the flashy kind. Not the kind where people meet at galas and hand each other business cards with embossed lettering. The quiet kind. The kind built over decades in break rooms and parking lots and occasional beers after long shifts. I had a friend I'd known since 1987. We'd worked the same district for 12 years before he moved on. He'd gone to work for the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. He retired a few years before I did, but we still talked regularly. He called me every few months. We argued about baseball. His name was Raymond, and he owed me a favor from a long time ago that neither of us had ever mentioned directly, but both of us knew about. The night I got back to my hotel, I sat on the edge of the bed, and I thought about it for a long time. I wasn't a law enforcement officer. I'd never carried a badge. But I knew how institutions worked, and I knew that when a man builds a real estate development company over 30 years and throws money around the way Conrad threw it around, there are usually records somewhere that tell a more complicated story. I opened my phone and I called Raymond. He answered on the second ring. "Wasn't expecting to hear from you," he said. "I know," I said. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen before you respond." I told him what I'd seen. I told him about the bowl, about Lily, about the way Conrad had spoken to my 7-year-old granddaughter. But I also told him the other things I'd noticed over 3 years. The cash transactions Conrad casually mentioned at dinners. The offshore investment account he'd referenced once, bragging, not realizing I was actually listening. The shell company name I'd spotted on a document that had been left out on his desk during a visit to his office, a name that didn't match anything in the publicly listed portfolio of Albright Development. Raymond was quiet for a long moment. "You've been paying attention," he said. "I'm a postmaster," I said. "I spent 30 years noticing things other people put down in writing." He didn't promise me anything. He said he'd make some calls. He said I shouldn't expect anything. He also said that the name Albright Development had come up in a context he couldn't discuss, once, maybe 18 months ago, and that the information I'd just given him was, and this is the word he used, interesting. We said goodbye. I hung up and stared at the ceiling for about an hour. Then I went to sleep. The months after that Thanksgiving were complicated. Renee called me less. I suspected Conrad had said something to Philip about my behavior at the dinner. Apparently leaving a room calmly with your granddaughter constitutes an incident when you're the kind of man Conrad was. Philip was apologetic in that way, where you can tell he's been coached on what to apologize for. I didn't push. I called Renee every Sunday. I asked about Lily. I sent her a new stuffed rabbit for Christmas because Mr. Buttons had started looking a little worn, and I wanted her to know she had options. Spring came, then summer. I grew my tomatoes. I took my walks. I didn't hear from Raymond. I'd started to think maybe nothing would come of it. Maybe Conrad was just a bully, not a criminal. Plenty of bullies live long, comfortable lives without consequence. The world is full of them. And then in August, my phone rang. "You need to know something," Raymond said, without even saying hello. "I can't give you details, because I can't. But I want you to not be surprised when you turn on the news sometime in the next few weeks. Raymond, I also want to tell you that the thing you mentioned, the shell company, that was a thread. And threads, when you pull them, sometimes the whole sweater comes apart." He hung up. It was a Tuesday in September, when my daughter called me, and her voice sounded like it had been put through something mechanical. "Dad," she said, "did you know?" I'd seen the news by then. Conrad Albright had been taken into federal custody the previous afternoon. The charges were significant: wire fraud, tax evasion across multiple years, and allegations that Albright Development had been used as a vehicle to launder money connected to fraudulent real estate transactions involving shell companies in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. The federal investigation had apparently been building for over a year. The number being discussed in the coverage was not small. The prosecutors didn't use the word millions loosely. "Did you know something?" Renee asked again. I paused. "I made a phone call," I said. "Dad." "He spoke to Lily the way no one should speak to a 7-year-old, I said. And that wasn't the only thing. I noticed things over the years. I passed along what I noticed to someone who would know what to do with it. The silence on the line lasted a long time. "I don't know how to feel about this," she finally said. "You don't have to feel any particular way about it," I told her. "You just have to decide what comes next." What came next was difficult, as these things always are when they're real. Philip was shaken. He hadn't known the full extent of his father's dealings, and the investigation confirmed that fairly early. There was a period of real tension where I know he wondered, and I think Renee wondered, whether I had done the right thing, whether I had gone too far, whether a family dinner is supposed to stay a family dinner, no matter what. But there was a custody dimension that most people didn't know about. Conrad had been quietly pressuring Philip to pursue full legal guardianship of Lily. Not because he wanted what was best for her, but because there was a financial structure he was building that involved the grandchildren's trusts. And Lily, as an adopted rather than biological grandchild, was a complicating factor he wanted to control or remove. Philip didn't know the full shape of it, but when the investigation uncovered the paperwork and the family attorney walked Philip through what Conrad had actually been trying to do, I watched my son-in-law sit down heavily in a chair and put his face in his hands. He was going to use the kids, Philip said. Just that. Nothing else. Renee put her hand on his back. I stayed where I was, across the room, and didn't say anything. Sometimes silence is the right answer. I'd learned that in 34 years of carrying mail, people tell you things when you're just a background figure. A familiar, predictable, unthreatening presence. The mailman, the postmaster, the retired federal employee in the armchair by the fire. Nobody saw me coming. That was always my advantage. Conrad's legal situation unfolded over the better part of a year. He hired expensive attorneys. He made statements through a publicist. His name came off the university building. The nonprofit boards asked for his resignation quietly and received it. He didn't go to trial. He took a plea agreement. I won't pretend I watched every detail of that process with any satisfaction. What I felt was closer to tired. The kind of tired you feel when something you knew was wrong is finally officially, formally, on the record, confirmed to be wrong. He received a federal sentence. He would be significantly older when he got out. Lily turned 8 2 months after the arrest. We had a small birthday party at Renee and Philip's house. Backyard, paper streamers, a chocolate cake with one of those candle numbers that always takes 4 or 5 tries to blow out. Lily wore a yellow dress. She ran around the yard with Philip's nieces and nephews and didn't press herself against any walls. At one point, she came over and climbed up next to me in the lawn chair and leaned against my arm. She didn't say anything for a minute. Then she said, "Grandpa, do you think Mr. Buttons and New Rabbit can both come to my party?" I looked down at her. "They're already here," I said. "I saw them on the couch." She nodded seriously. "I invited them. Good thinking," I said. She patted my hand and ran back to her cousins. That was enough. That was more than enough. Philip and I are not close the way Renee and I are close. We're not the kind of father-in-law and son-in-law who go fishing together or text each other about the game. But something changed after all of this. He started calling me on my birthday, not sending a card, actually calling. He asked my opinion last spring about whether to refinance the house. I gave him an honest answer. He thanked me. It's not the same as what we might have been if his father had been a different kind of man. But it's something real. And at 68, I've learned to value real things in whatever form they take. I was a mailman for 34 years. I knew every house on my route. I knew which families were struggling and which ones were doing well, and which ones had something dark behind the curtain, and I knew because I paid attention. I showed up day after day, without drama, without announcements, and I paid attention. Conrad Albright looked at me and saw a man who wasn't worth seeing. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about a lot of things. But none of them mattered more than being wrong about Lily. She picked up the bowl when he told her to, with shaking hands, because she was 7, and she didn't know yet that some people's anger says everything about them and nothing about you. She knows now. I'm making sure of it, one Sunday call at a time.